So I declare open this public hearing of the Joint Committee on the National Broadband Network. We need a motion to allow the media to take footage of the hearing. So before the first witness, I ask a committee member to move that the media be allowed to broadcast the proceedings today in accordance with the rules set down for committees, which include fair and accurate reporting of proceedings and not taking footage or still images of members' papers or laptop screens. Would someone like to move that? Thank you, Ursula. Tonight the committee will be hearing from the Chief Executive Officer of NBN Co on the recently announced Telstra and Optus deals and also the construction tender awarded to Silcar. If time allows, the committee may also seek information on the contract awarded to Fujitsu. So thank you, Mr Quigley, for appearing before the committee this evening. I now welcome Mr Quigley, and we've also have mentioned in the private meeting that Mr Darryl Quinlivan will be sitting in and available for the committee if needed. So, Mr Quigley, for the Hansard record, could you please state your name and the capacity in which you appear before the committee?
Yep. My name is Michael Quigley. I'm the Chief Executive Officer of NBN Co.
Thank you and welcome.
Thank you.
Although the committee does not require you to give evidence under oath, I advise you that these hearings are formal proceedings of the Parliament and warrant the same respect as proceedings of the respective houses. The giving of false or misleading evidence is a serious matter and may be regarded as a contempt of Parliament. The evidence given today will be recorded by Hansard and attracts parliamentary privilege. Mr Quigley, would you like to make an opening statement to the committee?
I would like to, Chairman.
Feel free.
Go away. So, Chairman, members of the committee, I'm going to start off with an opening statement reflecting some of the areas in which I understand the committee are particularly interested, some of which the Chairman has just mentioned. So that includes the state of NBN Co's construction contracts, the deals that we have recently announced with Telstra and Optus, and I'd also like to comment perhaps on a few other matters, our ongoing deployment plan, our corporate plan, the Greenfields program, which is topical at the moment, and perhaps just touch on the points of interconnect issue. So if I can turn first to construction. We announced on the 1st of June that we'd reached an agreement with Silcar to allow us to begin large-scale deployment. Silcar is a 50-50 joint venture between Siemens and T-Services. The agreement reflects terms and prices for construction worth $380 million over the next 2 years, $380 million, with the option of 2 further years and an additional value of $740 million. The agreement covers Queensland, New South Wales and the ACT, and it represents about 40% of our national construction activity for the next 2 years. The design and construction pricing in the Silcar agreement is consistent with NBN Co's corporate plan, and it followed some 8 weeks of rather intensive negotiations between NBN Co and Silcar. We believe the agreement represents a competitive and acceptable baseline for design and construction across the project. Through the negotiations, NBN Co and Silcar have established what we believe is the right balance between price reductions, certainty of volume, location of premises, appropriate payment terms and the benefits of initial exclusivity to defray overheads. The agreement includes 9 of the 19 NBN second release sites which have been previously announced by us, and these are first of all, extensions to the existing works of the first release sites in Kiama, Townsville and Armidale, and involves new sites in Springfield Lakes, Toowoomba and inner northern Brisbane, Riverstone in western Sydney, Coffs Harbour and Gungahlin here in the ACT. Following on from that contract, we've now commenced, or have commenced for some time, discussions with a group of construction companies for other regions in Australia, and we're using obviously the framework of the Silcar deal as a basis for those negotiations. We expect to be able to finalise those discussions with those other companies over the coming months, and we believe this will then put us in a position where we can obviously deliver on the other second release sites and in fact have coverage, construction coverage for the whole of the country. So that's a brief summary of the construction. Perhaps if I now move on to the deals, the deal with Telstra. We announced that deal on the 20th.
Sorry to interrupt. I'm just conscious of the clicking, and so if we hang on. Well, if we can wrap the photos up relatively quickly. And sorry to interrupt, Mr. Quigley.
Right.
Feel free to keep going.
Okay.
No, it's right. It's right. It is a public hearing. Thanks, guys.
Okay. So we announced the deal with Telstra on the 23rd of June. As you know, it took quite some time to reach that point. That's not too surprising. It was a very complex transaction. It was worth the wait, as I've said before. The outcome, we believe, is good for taxpayers and good for the broader community. We will, in making use of Telstra's facilities, avoid duplicating infrastructure, existing infrastructure. The deal reduces our costs, the cost to build the NBN. It reduces the risk of delays and, very importantly, reduces potential disruption to local communities. Importantly, Telstra also becomes an NBN customer, with the NBN becoming the preferred fixed-line platform to be used by Telstra for many years to come. This, as you would understand, provides some certainty on our revenue line. The deal allows NBN Co to use Telstra infrastructure over a minimum of 35 years. And, as I said, it eliminates the need to build duplicate infrastructure, which would have been a very bad outcome for the nation. The deal will have NBN Co pay Telstra progressively for the disconnection of copper connections and HFC connections, other than for HFC pay TV customers. We've also negotiated interim arrangements for immediate access to Telstra's infrastructure. That's ahead of what's called the commencement date, which is when the deal would become unconditional, assuming it was approved by the ACCC and approved by Telstra shareholders. So that interim arrangement allows us to get on with the network deployment for our second release sites. The total payments over time are estimated to deliver approximately $9 billion in June 2010 post-tax net present value to Telstra. That's based on their estimates. And it goes, I guess, without saying that the definitive agreements reached with Telstra are financially beneficial to NBN Co, which is consistent with the company's corporate plan, which was submitted to government back in December last year. Perhaps, if I can, while we're just talking about the Telstra deal, there was, in fact, at the last committee meeting that I attended, there were some of the members who were interested in the question of an FTTN deal as an option. I'd just like to, if I can, make a couple of remarks on that. The first is that the deal was an extremely complex deal with Telstra. To have negotiated in parallel another deal to allow us to use the copper would have been an added layer of complexity, which I am sure would have taken many, many months to reach a conclusion on, if it was possible to reach a conclusion at all, because it almost certainly wouldn't have been a lease arrangement. The second thing I would say is that the deal that we did do involved, in terms of infrastructure, ducts, pits, exchange space and dark fibre. It does not include copper. We did not negotiate a deal on the copper itself. We're not acquiring the copper, we're not leasing the copper. To contemplate doing an FTTN solution would have meant we would have had to include that in the deal. It would have been another component. There's been various public comments by various bodies about the cost of acquiring that copper. It would have certainly been an additional cost, there's no doubt about that. And the third point I'd just like to make is NBN Co is a government business enterprise, and our objectives are set by the government. The government did not instruct us in NBN Co to consider an FTTN deployment, and so it was not. It would have been irresponsible of NBN Co to start negotiating a deal which we weren't instructed to negotiate, and for which we almost certainly would have taken much longer and had to pay more money. So I'm, by the way, more than happy to address, if the committee has any other questions on FTTN, I'd be happy to address those if I can. If I can just say a few words now on the Singtel-Optus deal. The deal with Optus is one in which they progressively migrate their cable customers, that is their customers on their HFC network, onto our fibre network. And at the same time, Optus has agreed a fixed line network preference in favour of the NBN for residential and small business customers, so they will become a large customer of NBN Co, a large retail customer. And in turn, we've agreed in NBN Co to make progressive payments to Optus based on the actual number of customers that migrate from their HFC network onto the NBN. Optus's estimates of the value of that deal, which is based on the number of customers, is approximately $800 million on a post-tax net present value basis. Once the migration is completed from HFC to the NBN, Optus will decommission the parts of the HFC network that do not provide ongoing support for their mobile infrastructure and their business customers. So clearly they're not asking them to decommission parts they continue to use. Once again, it also goes without saying that the definitive agreement that we reach with Optus is obviously financially of benefit to NBN Co. Otherwise, of course, we wouldn't have done the deal. It both improves our take-up rates and, of course, in turn improves our revenue line. Perhaps now, if I move to just a couple of words on those other matters I mentioned. If I look at our ongoing deployment plan, for those of you who have read our corporate plan that we submitted last December, we had projected that we would have passed 13,000 brownfields premises by the end of June. It's on page 15 of our corporate plan. I'm pleased to report that as of the end of June, we have passed 14,256 premises. We had also anticipated launching our interim satellite service by the 30th of June. We did so on the 1st of July. We had anticipated that the interim satellite service would cover 165,000 eligible premises. That was our estimate at the time. Our latest estimate is, in fact, somewhat more than that. We expect it will be above 200,000 eligible premises that interim satellite service will cover. We had also anticipated prior to December of last year that there would be some 45,000 greenfields lot that would also need to be passed. But I think, as probably everybody in the room knows, there has been ongoing policy debate about the greenfields, the new developments, and in fact that policy has been particularly around the responsibility of Telstra and the responsibility of NBN Co, and it's taken some time to resolve that, and that has now, I believe, has been resolved and is subject to a bill that's before Parliament at the moment.
Right, now we may have to go and vote.
Yep. Okay. Now, the other thing, if I could comment, that greenfields is somewhat different to the brownfields in that greenfields is demand-driven, and so it's not a supply-driven business, it's a demand-driven business, and we're now working well with developers and I believe satisfying their requirements. And so the numbers that we pass in terms of greenfields will be the numbers that demand dictates. And so we continue to look at what those numbers will be, but they're really set by the developers. In terms of our overall deployment plan, we are now working closely with Telstra on determining the detailed availability of their infrastructure. We'll be using their ducts, their dark fibre, their exchange space, and we are working with them over a 12-week period to ensure we have a fixed plan with them. And so when that is completed, and perhaps even a little before that, we may be able to release a 12-month deployment plan and then a 3-year indicative deployment plan. So we hope to be able to do that in the near future. If I can just say a couple of words on the corporate plan. Committee members will know that we submitted a corporate plan on 17th of December, which anticipated a Telstra deal, but did not anticipate an Optus deal. We didn't have the Optus deal built into the plan. It also did not include the requirements we now have on us for greenfields. And there are additional consequences of the points of interconnect decision, moving from our assumption of 14 to 121 points of interconnect. which were not fully included in the corporate plan because that decision came just before we submitted the plan. We didn't have an opportunity to incorporate all of the issues. So we will, over a period of time now, be including all of those factors and any other implications that come from policy decisions by government into the next version of the corporate plan, which will be submitted to the government at their request. And I'd just like to make sure that the committee understands that it would be irresponsible of me to provide an on-the-run update of the corporate plan. It is an integrated document. For those of you who've seen it, it's a lot of moving parts in it. It really needs to be produced and read as a whole, and so I won't be commenting on any particular aspect of the corporate plan in relation to those changes I've just outlined. We need to recast the corporate plan, integrating all of that together. If I can just amplify a little bit on greenfields, we now, as I've said, we now have, I believe, the clarity, assuming the bill passes in the way we anticipate it will, for the responsibilities for Telstra and ourselves, both in what are called broadacre and infill developments in greenfield. That's been clarified by the government, and I hope it's what we'll see in the result of the legislation. We're now getting on with the job of meeting our obligations under that policy. Since the 1st of January of this year, we have had approximately 1,800 development applications representing close to 150,000 lots or premises. On the latest projections we plan to pass approximately 65,000 lots and connect approximately 40,000 premises during the coming fiscal year in greenfields. But as I said before, this is a demand-based business. It really will depend in the end on what the developers need and want. We should be able to firm those numbers up as the year progresses. And we now have started fibre deployment in 3 new developments in New South Wales. One is called Bunya, which is a broad-acre estate in Blacktown, which is west of Sydney. It has a total of 730 premises. There's another new multi-dwelling unit in Rhodes, which is on the Parramatta River, which is 107 premises. And in Bonnyrigg, we have a mixed low-rise MDU and single-dwelling residential development for 104 premises. We also have 33 new developments that are currently moving through various stages of our design and construction. And we expect to start work in these estates together with our partner Fujitsu over the next 4 months. We expect retail services to begin and be provided by retail service providers in some of these new estates from the second half of August. It has not been an easy task to make sure that we met those obligations when you don't have a network. So we have had to take some extraordinary measures to ensure we can locate fibre access node sites and provide transit backhaul back to interim points of interconnect to meet the demand from developers. And finally, on the points of interconnect, as you know, our original plan was to deploy 14 points of interconnect, but following the work of the ACCC, the government instructed us to deploy a semi-distributed POI model with 121 points of interconnect. With the 14 POI model, we would have in fact built our own POIs. With 121 POIs, it makes much more sense to largely use the Telstra existing exchange facilities because they're the points at which competitive backhaul generally terminates. So we are now working closely with Telstra, as I mentioned before, to establish the availability of those facilities and hence the schedule under which we can bring up the 121 points of interconnect and the associated fibre access node sites to which they connect. And also then the dark fibre availability which connects those fan sites to the points of interconnect. That obviously has a significant influence on our deployment plan and obviously our corporate plan. So in conclusion, I'd say we're now working hard to plan on the basis of the Telstra infrastructure being available, but as we all know, that has yet to be finalised and will not be finalised until Telstra shareholder and ACCC approval until they take place. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Quigley. We'll now go into questions from all the various members. I might just start with some governance questions and then hand over to the Deputy Chair, and then might sort of bounce around the room. And Paul, if you follow up after a bit, and we'll work it from there. In regards to just some broad governance questions in the relationship between the committee and NBN, there has been, it's been indicated by the committee that we're looking for regular reporting from NBN Co on how you are meeting key performance targets and measures in regards to the NBN rollout. Are you able to inform the committee what's been undertaken to provide the committee with this information on a regular basis?
Yes, we've been working closely with government on a range of KPIs, and my understanding is the instructions to us from government is that when that's established, the government will liaise with the committee to find which of those KPIs you would be interested in seeing. Right. I think I have that correct, Darryl?
That's right. Chair, I'm not sure if you received a letter from the two shareholder ministers today, but I understand a letter is on the way with a proposal for future reporting arrangements.
Okay, so that's right.
Because previously you had undertaken to provide us with first a draft pro forma program by the 1st of June, and then on the 30th of June the first program detailing the various elements of the project. That's where we left it the last time.
Maybe I misremember, but I had thought I had taken it on notice to consult with our board to see how we should approach this issue.
But if there's a letter in the mail that sort of captures some of that governance, I'll look forward to reading it. So that would also contain the question, the follow-up question around the performance report. That's right. To your understanding, what is in that letter?
Yes, it would, yeah.
Okay. All right. In regards to, I've just got a couple of questions on the Telstra and Optus deal, and then I'll throw it to everyone else, and if there's time afterwards, I might come back to some of the others, Silcars and other issues. In regard to the Telstra and Optus deals, is there any concern in regards to the time taken to arrive at the deals that it has affected the rollout timeframes? If so, in what way and by how much?
Okay, well, yes, clearly if the Telstra deal had been done earlier, it would have certainly been one less complexity to which the company was dealing. But overall, if you take the long view, the Telstra deal will certainly, as I mentioned, make the construction of the network considerably less difficult. We won't be boring, digging trenches, putting ducts in. So overall, we expect the completion time to move in, even though we may have started a little later because the deal was so complex and took quite some time. We'll certainly do it more cheaply and faster, and with a lot, which is very important, with a lot less disruption to the community. And what's also importantly, it shifted the ratio of aerial to underground deployment. We'll be doing far more underground deployment with the deal than we otherwise would have been doing.
Okay, so how much of the existing Telstra network will be subsumed into the NBN?
Oh,
do you know?
Can't answer that question. I don't. The topology and the overall lengths of the existing Telstra network is confidential information. Telstra, I don't have access to that. I know what it is that we have planned to order. I don't know what percentage of the network it is, but my feeling it would be a substantial percentage of their duct network.
And that would be the same answer for the existing Optus HFC network as to how much would be decommissioned?
It will be
decommissioned. Yes. So what's going on at their end? Basically?
No, I can't answer. The only thing I can say is they use the HFC network. Well, I should say some of the fibre reticulation network that's part of the HFC network to feed base stations, mobile base stations, and perhaps satisfy some business customers. They obviously will stay, but the connections to residential premises for normal broadband services will be decommissioned. All of them.
Right. My Love, which is the satellite and wireless part of it, the regional and rural, Can you just give an update on how these deals will add value to both of those networks?
One of the things that we have negotiated with Telstra is to accelerate what we call the transit build, which is what we call transit is going from the 121 points of interconnect to the something like 1,000 fibre access node sites, and with all of those dark fibre links that go in between them. That same network, which I distinguish, by the way, from the fibre access network, which then goes out, that same transit network is what we use for satellite and also for fixed wireless. We'll generally go out roughly 75 kilometres to base station sites from the fibre transit network. So that's a very important part of the fixed wireless network, and it's also an important part of connecting up the Earth stations for satellite. So that's why we're accelerating. That has allowed us to secure and perhaps even bring forward somewhat our fixed wireless service, which we're working quite hard on now, and we hope to be able to, in the second half of next year, begin to actually turn services on. And we have signed a contract with a leading vendor in wireless technologies, which is Ericsson of Sweden. And just in case there's any, I've been asked this question several times, asked why aren't we using LTE? We are using LTE. We're using it in fixed wireless configuration, not in mobile, but it's exactly the same radio technology.
All right. As a bit of a tangent, but an important example, I've received some correspondence from the School of the Air, who are concerned about the potential loss of video conferencing with the upgrade, or the so-called upgrade, in services. So they're very worried that it won't be provided through either satellite or wireless. Have you had any contact from the School of the Air that you're aware of, and in particular this issue around what they see as a potential downgrading of their ability to deliver School of the Air services?
No, I have not heard that, and I'm a little puzzled as to what would be downgraded.
Well, it's that they argue they are providing video conferencing services, and in their correspondence they are indicating that you will be unable to provide the equivalent services that they currently can.
But I'm puzzled.
But I'm happy to hand it over to you if...
Yeah.
Perhaps we could have a look at it if that correspondence could be brought to our attention.
Happy to.
Yeah.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. All right. Deputy Chair.
Thank you. I'm interested, as we all appreciate, technology moves very, very quickly, and I'm interested to hear how will innovation in NBN technologies and applications, which hopefully would lead to cost reductions and efficiencies, be encouraged over the lifespan of NBN.
Okay, well, they will go in various areas. Obviously, there's advances in technologies. We expect to see continuing advances in LTE technologies, so that we can increase the, I'll try and take each one in turn, we can increase the speeds and capacities in the fixed wireless network. As you know, at the moment it is 12 megabits per second that we've committed for. You will hear a lot of things, a lot of statements about 100 megabits per second on LTE and 300 megabits per second. I think there was even a trial, somebody talked about 600 megabits or 800 megabits per second on a trial. You've got to put those in the same category as you've probably heard of 26 terabits per second on lasers, on fibre. You put those in the same category. In the end, you have to do the engineering and the traffic engineering and say what service can you really be confident you can deliver. And with fixed wireless using LTE technologies, we can be confident we can deliver 12 megabits per second to a cell edge. So we're hoping with evolution of that technology and improvements in radios, we will be able to lift those speeds up. We would also expect costs of technology to come down over time. We expect that to happen in wireless. We expect it to happen in fibre technologies in GPON, and we will see ongoing continual improvements in GPON capability. Today, it's 2.5 gigabits per second down and 1.25 gigabits per second up, which you split. It won't be too many years before that'll be 10 gigabits per second down, and then some years after that it'll be 40 gigabits per second down. The fibre itself has almost unlimited capability, so it's just the terminal equipment on either end that needs to be upgraded. In terms of driving costs, we are treating the NBN using the same process improvement methodologies as you use in running a factory, except it's distributed, it's all over the country. So you can have a lot of continuous improvement type activities to lower costs and to continuously be reviewing your construction methodologies and your architectures and try and continue to drive improvements. I would be absolutely astonished if we didn't get the price per premise costs down progressively year after year. We would expect to do that. And the volumes are large enough that we absolutely should be able to do that. Now, so if I just mention one area in which that's a little trickier to do, and that is in satellite technology. You place a bet in satellite technology. When you launch the satellites, they're up there. You can't kind of tweak them and do retrofits on them. So once they're up, they're up.
Yep. Okay. Susan, we might hand over. We've lost Paul and Luke. I was going to hand to them.
Thanks, Chair. I have a question which really follows from the Chair's question concerning what happens to wireless and satellite, particularly in parts of rural New South Wales. Telstra's NextG network for wireless, not mobile phones obviously, but for wireless is becoming increasingly more prevalent, and they're adding to it quite a lot. And it's being seen as quite a reasonable broadband service, even though it's quite sensitive and has to be got just right. I say that because it seems to require a lot of intervention by Telstra. I'm just trying to get a picture of what will happen to those areas, both that are described as being within the footprint and outside the footprint, as NBN sort of moves into that area, and how will constituents and subscribers be looked after, given that Telstra will be going out one door, NBN coming in the other, and that development may not sort of happen in a seamless way?
We will absolutely try and make sure it does happen in a seamless way, working with Telstra if you're talking about the retirement of the copper and moving across onto another technology. Remembering in the wireless and the satellite footprint, the copper will remain for a long time. That's part of the, I can never remember the name of this new entity. TUSMA, yes, that will be doing that. Our wireless service, fixed wireless service, is intended to be complementary in the same way as a fibre service is complementary to a mobile service. The wireless service is not a mobile service, it's a fixed service, which means there's an antenna on the premise and there's a base station. The way in which we dimension that is considerably different from a mobile network. The priorities for what you do, mobility is good for mobility, but you may very well find, for example, that somebody's in our fixed wireless footprint and they're getting a broadband service. They may have a broadband service as they do on their mobile service, and they have one on their fixed wireless service, and they will run Wi-Fi off that. Just as you do now, you'll find when you use, for example, if you use your iPad, when you're travelling around, you'll use it on a 3G mobile network. But when you come into your home, you immediately switch onto a Wi-Fi network, and that is a fixed line service with a little radio bit just in the home, because you can download much greater amounts. And so
I understand that, and I can see that it would be a perfect world for subscribers to have a choice of both, but in reality Telstra needs all of the business, I would think, in order to be there in the first place. So how will it be determined who is looking after those people's needs, and will there be a planning exercise done? Because you have to say, well, first of all, are they in the fibre footprint, and if so, would they be able? Would it be in their interest to stay with the existing NextG network for broadband? So you're not going to be laying out a service that in fact people wouldn't in the end take up, given that we are talking the edges of the service, the more regional areas.
But if they are, if you distinguish those two cases, if they're in the fibre footprint, they're in the 93%. Doesn't matter where they are, they get the same service, whether they're in the city or whether they're in the most remote places on the last percentile of the 93%. They will still get exactly the same service as people in the city on the fibre footprint. I expect they would do what most people in the city do, is that they would use both services. Now, it could be that Telstra would be supplying both services, Optus could be supplying both services, VHA could be supplying both services, or they could be getting mobile service from Telstra and a broadband fixed line service from Internet or IONet or Internode or any one of the others. So they have much greater choice than they've had previously. The two services are, as I mentioned, are complementary. Mobile's good for mobile, but it just simply isn't a good solution for downloading large files because spectrum is scarce and it's expensive. So I would expect them to use them in those complementary ways. They may have, if they're just making a phone call, they're likely use the 3G network. If they're going to download a file, either on their PC or on their iPad, especially if it's a video file, they will use the fixed line network.
I understand. What proportion then, if I can frame the question a slightly different way, what proportion of the next G network that operates for broadband as opposed to mobiles do you expect to be reduced as a result of NBN moving into the area?
I don't expect it to be reduced at all. What I expect to see is what we're seeing in a lot of overseas mobile carriers, which is they're building more and more mobile networks, 3G networks, putting in more capacity, trying to acquire spectrum, building more capability, and at the same time trying to get traffic off the mobile networks just as fast as they can, because the mobile networks can't keep up with the demand for downloads. iPads and iPhones are just simply killing 3G networks in other parts of the world. That's why the two are complementary.
Thank you.
Luke, sorry.
If you could just give us a bit of a Cook's tour. If we go back to the construction contract, the tender that was curtailed on the 1st of April, if you could just give me a bit of a Cook's tour of the way that tender was structured as far as what NBN Co was seeking from the tenderers, fixed time, fixed price, whatever, blah, 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 and then move to Silcar and the variation between what you originally tendered for and what we now have as the contract offering.
So I can answer the question in general terms. The details, perhaps, if I can take on notice, just to be precise about it to the extent that I can. The original tender was a tender in which we went out, I think recollection is to 15 tenderers that came in. We specified what it is we need. We broke the country up into quite a number of regions, and people were free to put prices in for different regions. We did our best to specify everything we could that we thought would be useful to the tenderer in terms of information they would need to supply us with prices and conditions. We had set clauses, as you would have in such normal tenders, and what we got back is a range of, across the 15 tenderers, different prices, different legal responses, what we call you'd build up normally a pricing and compliance matrix. We went through several rounds of refining that, going back to the tenderers, and as you would expect, what you also find is some people who have kind of fallen right off the end, that their prices are so high they really can't be considered too much further. You then start to look at, well, what if we change these conditions? What if we change those conditions? What impact would that make on your legal compliance statements? What would it make on prices and terms and conditions? But we had to be going through that with everybody at the same time. It was quite a difficult process. Remembering this was also somewhat new, and it's large scale, and people were concerned about a number of issues, of course, as you understand, if you're a contractor looking at this deal. We came to the conclusion that we weren't going to get to the position we needed to get to under that construct.
Okay, now just at that point, was the contract for a fixed guaranteed price for each let's just say the 10 units or however many units you've broken it up to, were you contracting for a fixed price?
No, I wouldn't say it was for a fixed price. It was normally, and I'd have to go check the details of this, but normally such contracts are on a schedule of rates.
So it's a schedule of rates.
More schedule rates, yes. Now, I'm giving you the general picture. We should take this on notice and
okay. And of the schedule of rates, what were the rates? Were they per house connected or per kilometre of wire?
Much more detailed.
Sorry?
There are a lot of details of the many activities that go into building up the job.
Okay, so how many activities?
I don't know off the top of my head. Quite a number.
And so that would be just from a layman's point of view, there would be the number of houses passed, and then there would be the number of houses, I guess, connected, and then there would be the pipes.
It's a much greater granularity than that. You'll actually look at remediation of pits, ducts. There's a whole range of activities.
Okay. Yeah. And in relation, so we've got a schedule of rates, and what were the variances? Were there variances for the ground conditions, for instance?
Oh, certainly, yes. There almost certainly would be rock allowances. We wouldn't expect people to have the same price if they're going through sand as if they're going through very hard granite.
And yeah, what I'm trying to get to is, so was there a fixed time involved for the completion of certain elements of the contract?
No, I think I'd have to check on this. We may have had some indicative times, but there would also, like you would do in any contract, whether you're buying equipment or services, that's generally a negotiation. The tenderer offers you what they think are realistic timeframes that they can do things in. And that's one of the things you may compare.
And what about for if the project went longer than expected? What were the arrangements there for on a contractor?
They are quite complex in terms of a whole range of potential. You can have liquidated damages, you can have various extensions, you have all sorts of arrangements.
And you had all of those?
We had. Well, I can't tell you off the top of my head once again what was specified in that original, or whether we left it open to a negotiation. I can't tell you. I have to go check.
Because this is a hearing to really ascertain the details of the building contracts. And say on labour rates, was there provision for escalation in labour costs in the original contract?
There's almost always in labour, if you're looking at multi-year services, that as a large component of labour, it's not unexpected you would have some expected escalation. Now, once again, I'll have to check on the details on that.
And was there provision for, let's just say that labour escalated over a particular rate, where did that risk lie?
That I'll have to check.
Remember,
we've been through a process in which we've gone through a new process. I've been focused, frankly,
rather
heavily
on
the latter part.
And then where we are now.
Well, that's what I like to be sure of. I don't want to mislead the committee, so I better take that one on notice and check.
Okay, and then so we've talked about cost, we've talked about labour, we've talked about time. What about wet weather on time? Prolongation on wet weather? Who would take the risk on wet weather on a project, that project, under the original tender?
That I can't. I'll have to take that one on notice.
I think, how about, would it be fair enough if what was taken on notice is the issue of basically how is risk calculated and how has it or will it be managed? Is that basically where you're going?
Well, where I'm coming from is I was wanting to get a handle on the division of the risk between the client and the contractor, and within the original contract sum, the degree of assurance that the costs as tendered were going to be the actual costs incurred by NBN Co. And then moving on to the new contract, what were the differences between the new contract and the old contract? Yeah, exactly. Okay. And a cost comparison.
Certainly, all of those issues, we issue tender documents, so there'll be a lot of detail in those tender documents about those conditions for the original tender. So we can look those up. They're public documents, frankly. We can pull them out and we'll find all that information for you.
But to arrive at the new contract, which is now within budget, the old contract was not within budget. I would presume...
We never reached a contract in the other one.
Sorry?
We never reached a contract.
Yeah, well, yeah, sorry, correct. So the original offers, the difference between the original offers at a certain sum and the new arrangement that you've come to, there must be a difference in the way the risks were shared and apportioned, I presume. What were the basic differences between the sharing of the risks?
Yes. So if I can distinguish, by the way, just to be clear there, we may have in the tender document our proposal for how risks should be shared and how certain things should be done. The responses we get from all of the tenderers may not comply with those.
Yeah,
they may suggest alternatives. Okay, but what I can't do is give you those responses.
No,
I can only tell you what we originally requested. I can't tell you what each individual respondent responded with.
Well, as a matter of broad principles, then, just for my education, what was the shift in the risk-taking from your original versions to what you've settled on?
Okay, I can tell you what was in the original in terms of our proposal. As I mentioned in my opening statement, the framework for the agreement we have reached with Silcar is the basis for the ongoing negotiations that we have now with a number of other parties, and so it would be inappropriate for me to spell those out at this point in time because there's an ongoing, if you like, competitive process that's going on now.
But as a matter of principle, couldn't we talk about the risks that NBN Co now is assuming to achieve a lower cost price or lower contract price? Or are you proposing to be varying the mix of risks between tenderer and NBN Co from contract to contract as you move forward?
That's quite possible. In the same way as the deal with Telstra and the deal with Optus is different. They're two different deals. We negotiated them separately. It's quite possible that the deal that we would strike with contractor A might be different to the one we'd strike with contractor B because they have various relative weights. They may be operating in regions where things are somewhat different. They may put a different value on different components. That's quite possible.
Because I think it's of interest, it's certainly of interest to me, and I'd imagine it's of interest to the committee to get a handle on the risk to which we're exposed. And certainly the desal plant, Wonthaggi desal plant site agreement was something that was of great interest within the contracting industry. As a member of this committee, I'm really interested in our risk exposure to cost overrun, given that we go back to the 1st of April when the tender process was abandoned on the basis that the costs were substantially more than budget. We managed to bring those within budget. I'm really interested in whether we are going to actually achieve a turnkey cost that is within budget or whether we're really only shifting the risk to be basically realised by the client, by NBN Co at a later time.
In each case where we've negotiated deals, we never just look at the price. We look at a combination of factors of timing, performance, risk, which is why, by the way, the Telstra deal took so long to negotiate, which is why it would have been, frankly, simpler for us just to sign up a construction contract with the tenders that had come in. As you would probably realise, going out to the market and saying we're suspending this process and moving into a new one subjected us to a lot of criticism, a lot of public criticism. We knew it would. We undertook it to look after the best interests of the public. So you can be assured that we didn't just look at price, we looked at that combination of price, risk, conditions, terms and conditions. Now, to the best of our ability, we'll try and give the committee an insight into that without prejudicing the ongoing negotiations that are taking place.
Because the sorts of things that I'm interested in would be who's responsible for prolongation due to industrial disputes, who's responsible for materials cost increases, all those sorts of parameters, those very basic parameters. I think it's important for the committee to have an insight into those risks and the degree of protection from risk that's inherent in the contract.
Understood.
So you have that question on notice is, how's risk calculated and how's it managed at the same time?
But I would like it in fairly specific terms, not in broad brush general terms.
So including the factors that are taken into consideration.
Correct. And itemised.
Well, best if we can without, as I said, prejudicing the negotiations that are going on.
And you mentioned design and construct. The new contract is design and construct?
Yes. Well, sorry, when we say design and construct, design means different things to different people. What we're talking about here is the physical implementation of the architecture reflected in a top-level design that NBN Co will have done, and then the implementation in a specific instance in terms of this fibre goes from here to here this way is done by the construction company, in most cases. So they both do the physical design on the ground in detail.
What, do you give them a schematic and then they work up the detail from your schematic? Is that what happens?
It's not so much a schematic as we give them a document, quite a substantial document, where we have planned out what is called a fibre serving access module. So this is about 3,000 premises. We will have put the boundaries on it. We will have determined which premises are in those boundaries. We will, in fact, one of the things we have done is bought a tool set from a small Queensland company that is a very sophisticated mathematical optimisation tool set. It's really very clever, using integer programming, and it actually optimises given the costs of pits, ducts, all the different components, it optimises the path. We use that, run that tool, and then supply that file and the data set to the construction company who do the actual physical design work. Okay, so they may say this is where the plinth's going, the concrete plinth for the fibre distribution hub. This is exactly where the duct is going to go. And in that process, of course, since we're using Telstra ducts, is a process where we have to supply information to Telstra to tell them which ducts we anticipate using, so if they need remediation, they can remediate them.
And what sort of consultants, and so does NBN Co warrant all the consulting work that your consultants do? Do you warrant that as being all tickety-boo to the contract?
Sorry, which consultants?
Well, your design consultants that you use.
They're not consultants, they're employees.
Or employees. You warrant that to the contractors that that's all good?
Yes, of course. Well, when we say we warrant it to the contractor, contractor, yes, we'll use that. There's always, if there's small differences, if, for example, they hit, let's just say there wasn't duct available and they had to do some boring and they hit some real obstacle, we would have an interchange there and say, let's do it this way.
No further
Okay, well...
One more quick question, an easy question. No, Optus deal, you said 800 million post-tax PV.
NPV, yes.
What is the pre-tax cash cost, nominal?
I couldn't tell you off the top of my head.
Could you let us know?
No, probably not.
Well, I thought it'd be...
Was it?
I just asked for Optus.
This is we've done deals with two public companies. We have to make sure that we respect confidentiality of that.
At the end of the day, you'll draw a cheque that's funded by taxpayers for X dollars, in nominal dollars. It won't be in present value dollars. I'd really like to know what the cheque that the taxpayer's handing over is going to be.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a fair question, because it'll be borrowed against the taxpayer's liability.
I can only tell you what we've released the information that when we worked with both parties we did a deal with, they were comfortable with releasing. I'll have to take that one on notice.
All right.
But you've publicised the post-tax values, or the government's publicised the post-tax values, hasn't it?
Yes.
So, put the tax back in. How can that be commercially sensitive?
No problem putting the tax back in. We can probably do that.
Yeah. Okay. Now
in terms of pre-tax values?
Now that Mr...
Which I understood Mr Hartsucker to be asking about.
No, he was asking another level of detail beyond that. He was asking for nominal dollars, not NPV.
So there was two elements.
So
okay.
now that Mr Fletcher and Senator Xenophon have turned up, we might have a break for 50. It is according to the time of 7:15, so we'll have a 15-minute break. I'll go and get a bit of that correspondence I was talking about before. Just before... 20 minutes, sorry. Yep. Yeah. We'll do the best we can.
We better push on till 8 and then have a break.
But then we're not having a
Yeah, there's a couple of people with commitments. Just before we do, can I just clarify, you gave some figures in your opening statements that I just wanted to confirm. For the fibre to the premises for the brownfields at June 2011, in the corporate plan it's 13,000, you had a figure over 14,000.
14,125, I think it was. I'll just look it up again, something close to that.
And then the satellite, these two I'm not that fussed about. The satellite first release in the corporate plan, it was 165,000.
165,000, yeah.
And you were up around the 220,000?
No, I'm saying it's above, we believe it'll be above 200,000. Now, that's on the basis of people we think who will qualify for that satellite service.
Eligible. It was this other one, the fibre to the premises, greenfields, the BOT, the build, operate, transfer.
Well, we're not using a build, operate, transfer model now.
And that's the one I just wanted to clarify. Okay. So how are we to benchmark against that?
That would be very difficult to benchmark against that number in the December corporate plan because the model's changed and what we had to do is changed. And this is, as I said, it's a demand-driven. That was our estimate of what the demand from developers would be. It's with all the shifts and changes between ourselves and Telstra, what we're now dealing with is the demand that's actually coming into us and projecting numbers on the basis of that demand's coming in. As far as I'm aware, we are satisfying developers' requirements to provide them with services when they will need services turned on. And that's our aim.
So that would more be what we would use be something like a time.
Yes.
You know, it's more a time-specific benchmark.
It's not. It's I think a benchmark for the committee, if you want to see how well we were performing on greenfields, would be to see, are we meeting our obligations?
60-day, 90-day.
Yes, to our contracts that we write with. Now, if we get, for example, a request from a developer to turn a service on in Mount Newman tomorrow, we obviously can't do that. We have to negotiate with them what's feasible, agree with them, and then we have to perform to that.
Okay, thanks for clarifying that. So we might have just that quick break and see you back here in 15-20 minutes.
Okay.
Thank you. 7:35, we'll kick off again. Thank you. And we'll start with you, Paul.
Thank you. See, I knew it was a parrot too.
Paul ran away when I said... So do you want to start after the break? Welcome back, everyone. Before we begin, the school, just for the record, the School of the Air issue, I just went back to the office and got some correspondence. Mr Quigley's kindly agreed to take it on notice and provide some information back to the committee in regards to the ability of the School of the Air to do distance education programs better than what they have done in the past, where possible using the NBN service, and just trying to clarify issues in and around that topic. So that's one, and the other is that I haven't received that letter from the two shareholder ministers as far as my inbox, so look forward to getting that in the next couple of days.
Yes, I'm sure it's on the way.
Senator Cameron.
Yes, thanks, Chair. I might start with Mr Quinlivan. Are you aware of a magazine called Technology Spectator?
No, I'm not, Senator. I'm aware of a Business Spectator journal that you're probably all familiar with as well.
Well,
no, not technology.
This may be part of it, maybe the technology part, but there's a writer called Paul Budd who talks about the building the high-speed broadband, and he says that to be a successful and high-speed broadband network, you need to work on both the demand and supply side, and he calls it the trans-sector approach. And what he says is that it's pleasing that in Australia the NBN is linked to a trans-sector policy, which is clearly stated in the recently launched National Digital Agenda. Now, what link is there to NBN on the National Digital Agenda?
Well, I assume what he's referring to is an attempt by the government through the programs you referred to, the digital economy strategy, to create innovative uses of the NBN in a whole range of nominated sectors, but particularly education and health. And the government's made a series of announcements since the budget, and I think there are quite a number more to come around the digital productivity agenda. And and I assume the point being made by that writer is that they will stimulate use of the NBN and generate economic benefits.
Yeah, and then he goes on to say that comparing South Korea with Australia, or for that matter a comparison between any two countries, is futile, since political, social, economic, geographic and environmental situations vary so widely. There is also the viewpoint of the ITU UNESCO Broadband Commission for Digital Development, the OECD and the World Bank. This is also the viewpoint of these organisations. They all advocate that we should learn from each other but not copy each other. South Korea has most certainly been a leading case study for countries developing their own national strategies, and now the world is watching Australia. Is that a fair comment?
Well, I take it the point being made is that countries should do what's in their own best interests, and in pursuing those interests they should seek to learn the lessons from experience elsewhere, but only apply it where it's in their interests, and I'd certainly agree with that principle. Yep.
And I may come to Mr Quigley on this. You invited further questions on the fibre to the node issue. Again, Mr Turnbull's been raising the cost effectiveness of fibre to the node as compared to fibre to the home. Do you want to just expand on your initial comments on that?
Yes, Senator. I was commenting on the question that was raised at the last committee meeting about why didn't we negotiate a deal for fibre to the node as well as fibre to the home, and I think I explained why that would have been probably not the appropriate thing for NBN Co to have done at that time. Another, perhaps just a little more detail on that, to really negotiate a deal with Telstra to look at a fibre to the node, or even a hybrid combination of fibre to the prem, fibre to the node network, you really have to do a proper architectural design for fibre to the node. it takes into account a large number of factors, and it would require a great deal of work. Fibre to the node, you can use various technologies, ADSL 2+, VDSL, VDSL2. The cold hard reality for the existing copper infrastructure, in our estimates, approximately, and we haven't done all the detailed work, but approximately 40% of our fibre footprint, of our 93% that we have today, if you were to use a fibre to the node, you could not use VDSL2 on, which means you won't get the sorts of speeds that people are often quoting, as I talked about before, some of these very high speeds. If I can just draw that distinction again so everybody understands, with ADSL and copper-based services, the performance declines as you move further away from a node or an exchange. And with the higher speeds technologies, such as VDSL or VDSL2, the rate at which it declines is even more rapid. You can get higher speeds close to the node, it declines quite rapidly. So we would be in a situation where you would have, with a fibre to the node solution, you'd have a large number of cabinets, by the way. Each one has to be powered. Each one has to be thought about in terms of environmental conditions. That probably, if you're building a fibre to the node network, something like 70,000 of these cabinets all over the country, and you just simply wouldn't. You'd have quite big differences in performance, depending on where you are. You would also need to do some remediation of the copper, and the reality is also that the network, some of these techniques that you hear about overseas where people talk about 100 meg services, use technologies such as vectoring, phantoming, bonding. Each one of those requires you to have more than one pair available. Bonding and phantoming requires that, which means you need to have 2 copper pairs for every premise you're going to put this service on. We often don't have that in Australia, and the lengths are long. The only way you get over that is you push these nodes closer and closer to the end point. The other fact that we would need to take into account if we did a design is that the watts per service in a fibre to the node technology is about double that of fibre to the premise. And that's something that the University of Melbourne, for example, has done a lot of study on. Now when you're talking about something that's nationwide, that's a big difference in energy consumption. So it's something we would have to take into account. Reminding people that with fibre to the premise, you go from a fan site all the way to a premise, and that can be 12 or 15 kilometres. There's no active electronics in there. It's all passive. You don't need to power anything in that. So there is a huge difference in a fibre to the node and a fibre to the prem architecture. Increasingly, people are using fibre to the prem architectures. People who have used fibre to the nodes have tended to be the large incumbents who don't have a requirement to separate. They do deals with regulators. They say, well, broadband stuff, provided we can, provided we don't have to unbundle in any way. So it's a technology that tends to be used more by vertically integrated incumbents. You've even seen companies such as Deutsche Telekom, who started probably around 2004 with a fibre to the node technology, who subsequently moved to fibre to the premise. So they've done that shift. There is, for all of those reasons, the job of architecting and designing and thinking about and building a business case for a fibre to the node technologies is a big job. It's a very big job. It's not that it's impossible, it's just a very big job to do. It almost certainly you need to have good access somehow to the copper, which would probably mean an acquisition of the copper in some way. We just simply, NBN was not NBN Co's direction to undertake that kind of analysis. And it's not a straightforward analysis to say that it's a clear case that you could do it cheaper in these circumstances with a fibre to the node architecture. You have to compare apples with apples. You just simply, for 93% of the population, if we do it with fibre to the premise, you get guaranteed performance in that footprint With a hybrid, a fibre to the node type architecture, you simply don't get that kind of guaranteed performance. So the objectives would need to be modified of what it is we were trying to do.
Yep. Mr. Turnbull's just arrived. Now, it's good timing because I just want to take you to some of the comments that Mr. Turnbull made in the debate on the fibre deployment bill. Mr. Turnbull said that the reality is that the NBN will not deliver more affordable broadband. It argues a number of points on that. One is that Telstra and Optus won't be able to use their HFC networks. And that is a lack of competition, so you won't be able to get a competitive pressure. That broadband speeds at 100 megabits a second in South Korea, people are not prepared to pay more for the higher speeds, and you've factored into your business plan that people will pay more for higher speeds. Maybe just to take those 2 points, because there are a number of points I want to take you to, but on those 2 points, what's your view on that?
Okay, well, first of all, on the HFC network, it's true in the deal we've done with both Telstra and Optus, they won't be able to use the HFC because the deal, in fact, says that those two networks will be decommissioned for the purposes of broadband. Now, that was a choice that those two companies made in doing the deals, but I would say, overall, there's a fundamental principle here. It's a question of what is the right answer for Australia? Is it to have a uniform wholesale architecture that's built once with the same, that allows people to get onto the network with the same processes, no matter where those customers are, the same systems, the same interfaces, provide the same services, or do you build a patchwork of networks? That is an argument that you can take both ways. There are pros and cons of that. I guess the principle on which the NBN is based is it makes good sense for a country the size of Australia to have one wholesale open access network, so that you're building a uniform network. You are building it, it's true if you built it in different bits, different technologies, you probably could build it somewhat cheaper, but you've got to think about the long term there as well. I think very few people would doubt that a fibre infrastructure is going to be here for a very long time. You just simply can't say the same thing about a fibre to the node network. You may put active cabinets out, which may do the job for 5 years, they may do the job for 10 years. You just don't know. So there's a fair chance you will be putting a large investment out, which some of it very well could be have to be scrapped at some point in time. So there's a fundamental question there for what is the right answer given the size of Australia. The fact is the government of the day made a decision, instructed NBN Co to go build a fibre to the prem network, and that's what we're doing.
Well, that doesn't answer. How happy I am that we're going to be going through this whole debate again. No, because I love this on replay.
Well, I'm hoping we're not, Doug. Is there, because we've got a few more questions. Is there any?
I'm happy to move on.
Did you want me to answer the second part of the question?
Yeah.
Senator, on.
I'm not sure what the first question was. You didn't answer any of the question.
Well, we're trying to keep the show moving.
What was it? Someone said something. What do you think? Was that the question?
But you're questioning me now.
Well, I'm just trying to understand what your question was, so I can understand.
You don't need to understand.
Work out whether
as long as Mr. Quigley understands, and he's got a better capacity to understand than you would ever have.
Oh,
so I'm quite happy
you know,
with that.
Doug, for once I agree with you.
Yeah.
For once I agree with you.
Okay, Paul.
Thank you. Mr. Quigley, can I just start by checking on a couple of issues I asked you about at the hearing on the 16th of May that I don't appear to have received answers to, and if I have, I apologise. I just wanted to confirm. I asked you what percentage of homes would be connected using overhead cable, and approximately how many thousands of kilometres of overhead cable would there be in the access network? Have you been able to provide an answer to that question?
I think we provided some answers on that, but we probably didn't give you precise answers because we don't know the precise answers.
So what is the current position on that point?
We won't know the final numbers on aerial versus underground until we've we've actually done the designs. We can give you approximations, but that's the best we can do at this stage. And I think you asked a question specifically on Bradfield.
I did.
We don't know the answer to those questions on Bradfield until we've done what I talked about earlier, which is that design, that network design.
Is there a minimum percentage that will be overhead in the network?
No, I wouldn't say there's a minimum percentage. We expect to do some aerial, and in fact, for example, in Tasmania now we've done some aerial. We are hoping we can use the maximum amount of duct that is possible to use, but that will depend on how much duct that Telstra can make available. There'll also be some circumstances in which, even if there isn't duct available, we will choose to underground, but in other cases we may do some aerial. I would still expect perhaps 20–25% of the network, access network, would be aerial. None of the distribution network will be aerial, but the access network perhaps around those figures.
So is it fair to say 20 to 25% is the working assumption?
That's probably, yes, close to the working assumption.
Thank you.
Now, as I said, we've yet to reiterate, we've yet to close the loop on all of the Telstra details and build that back into the next version of the corporate plan.
We also had a discussion at the hearing on the 16th of May about the basis for the view in the corporate plan that wireless-only households will go from 13% to effectively a ceiling of 16.3. I think that's what the corporate plan says, and it will effectively get to that number by 2025 is the assumption, and then broadly flatten out. There was a bit of back and forth about whether we were talking about the same definition of wireless only in two different parts of the corporate plan. I think that issue has been resolved. Tell me if you disagree.
I'd have to check on that in terms of the questions on notice. Coming back to you on that.
Well, if I can just put the question to you.
Yep.
And if you're able to answer it now, that would be helpful. What is the basis for the belief that with wireless-only homes having grown from roughly 4% to roughly 13% in the last 10 years, that percentage will now effectively reach a ceiling of 16.3%, as opposed to an alternative scenario in which that percentage continues to rise? Can you explain the thinking there?
I can explain in broad terms the thinking. Now, as I said, we did quite a number of studies. We also got some external consultants to give us a view on it as well, to make sure what we believed was consistent with a number of independent views. What we're seeing is a tendency now, when we speak to large telcos around the world, as I've mentioned, they are continuing to build out their mobile networks, and they're continuing to build them out as rapidly as they can, and they're continuing to try and acquire as much spectrum as they can, use the latest technologies, and while they're doing that, they are trying to shed traffic from their mobile networks as fast as they can. They're trying to get traffic off their mobile networks because the mobile networks are congesting. Why are they congesting? They're congesting because of iPhones and iPads, and what they're attempting to do is get that traffic off onto fixed-line networks, onto, for example, fixed-line networks terminated with Wi-Fi. That tendency is not decreasing. If anything, we've seen it increase. But notwithstanding that, in fact, I think there was one, I can't forget which analysis company it was, that said fixed mobile substitution is in fact now starting to happen back the other way. We still don't believe there will. We still believe there'll be a significant number of wireless only or mobile only homes, but it's clear with larger penetration of video and streaming video, which, as we know, around the world is simply taking off, mobile networks can't cope with it. So we will see a reliance on fixed-line networks for a long time to come.
If that assumption turns out to be wrong, in other words, if wireless-only homes continue to grow,
how much of a risk does that pose to the corporate plan?
We've done a sensitivity analysis of if the wireless-only homes was a higher percentage, it has an impact, but not a dramatic impact.
Can you share that analysis with the committee?
Have to have a look at it if I can. I'll see if we published. I thought we published some sensitivity analysis in the corporate plan. I have to have a look at whether we did or we didn't.
Thank you. If I can ask you some questions about the deal with Optus. Under the deal with Optus, as distinct from the deal with Telstra, is it correct that what NBN Co is paying for is in effect, the transfer of customers from Optus's network to NBN Co's? You're not separately acquiring the use of Optus assets or facilities?
That's correct. We are not acquiring assets.
There's been some commentary that the per customer price that you are paying for the Optus, under the Optus deal, is substantially higher than the per customer price represented by the Telstra deal. What would your comment be on that?
First of all, it's commentary from whom?
Oh, well,
people who might know?
A range of people, but let me put the question another way. What is the price per customer that you are paying to Optus as compared to the price per customer you're paying to Telstra?
I'm not at liberty to divulge that information. It's commercially sensitive information, and from either from Telstra or Optus,
800 million divided by 500,000 would give you
$1,600.
$1,600, wouldn't it?
I would suggest you don't. The calculation isn't that simple.
Do you want to enlighten us?
Is it correct that you are paying significantly more on a per customer basis under your deal with Optus than you are under your deal with Telstra?
In our deal with both Optus and Telstra, naturally, we tried to keep the deals as aligned as we possibly could. Now, that wasn't always possible everywhere, but that was my aim, to keep the deals as aligned as possible.
I'll repeat the question. Is it correct that you are paying more on a per customer basis under the Optus deal than under the Telstra deal?
You can't compare the two deals. You can't take one element of the deal and compare them.
And that's because the Telstra deal involved...
Sorry, Ed.
There was a gap. I just thought it was... Yeah, sorry.
No, I appreciate your...
No, I wasn't asking a different... it was on that line of questioning. My apologies.
Can I ask you to take that on notice and come back to us with advice on that point?
Well, I can tell you that I can't advise you on the point because it's commercially confidential, and in addition, there is no direct comparison. You can't do a direct comparison.
When you say you can't do a direct comparison, isn't it the case that under your deal with Telstra, one of the components you are paying for that you have separately broken out is you are paying Telstra each time a customer switches off on the Telstra network,
yes,
and your deal with Optus similarly involves you paying Optus each time a customer switches off on the Optus network?
Yes, but we have two types of technology with Telstra and one type with Optus.
In each case, what you are acquiring is a mix of broadband and voice-only customers. Is that right or not?
Yes, but in one case we're paying for disconnection, in the other case we're paying for migration. And in one case we're paying for a mix of two technologies, in another case we have just one technology. You can't compare them.
And let me just get this clear. What you're putting to the committee is that after you've done a deal in which you're committing to spend $800 million with Optus and several $1 billion with Telstra, money which is sourced in its entirety at the present time from taxpayers, you are not prepared to disclose to this committee the basis for any difference between the per customer valuations that you're paying to Telstra or Optus.
But as I said, I made the very best effort to keep them as aligned as I possibly could.
And is it a value for money question? The line of questioning is in relation to value for money for the overall project, or...?
The that is certainly one of the questions which is raised by this.
By using a direct comparison between the two
Absolutely,
deals?
that would be a standard commercial metric you would apply. If you are paying for, in effect, the transfer of a customer base, you'd ask yourself, how much are you paying per customer? That is a very standard way you would approach this. So my question to Mr Quigley is, let me be clear, are you putting to us that there is not a material difference between the amount per customer that's being paid to Telstra and the amount per customer that's being paid to Optus?
I would say that in the context of the two deals, that we did everything we could to keep them as aligned as possible. Now, you just simply can't pick a number out and another number out and compare them. You need to look at all of the factors that go into making up the deals.
So what you're putting to the committee is that it is inappropriate to analyse this in terms of a per customer valuation?
Well, yes, I'm saying if you want to analyse the deals, they are extraordinarily complex. We had advice from investment bankers. We had advice from a lot of people. We've done a lot of work on analysing those. It's very difficult to pull out two numbers and say we should compare those. It would be misleading of me to do so.
Let me put the question another way. Are you...
Well, this might be the last way, because it's the fourth way I think you've put the question.
Well, it's an important question, Mr.
Sure.
Chairman, but I'm just trying to get some illumination here. Are you putting to the committee that to the extent there is a difference between the value per customer paid to Telstra and to Optus, that is because of the difference in the value NBN Co is receiving under those two deals? In other words, are you putting to us that it is management's assessment that while you may be paying more to one than the other, that is justified by the difference in the benefit that NBN Co is receiving as a result of the deal?
Yeah, and clearly we would only pay what we put a value on, and we would pay what we thought was the appropriate amount for value. And those value equations are different in the two deals.
And so my question to you would be, could you provide to the committee an explanation of which deal involves a higher per customer cost and what is the value benefit that you get in exchange for the higher per customer amount being paid?
No, because I don't understand what you mean by per cost. Are you talking about just the straight dollar value? Just in dollars, you're talking about...
Yes.
If one is bigger than the other, but they're not related to the same thing.
So what I'm asking you is, if one is bigger than the other, why is that? And
Well, I can tell you now, for example, one's a migration, the other's a decommission. One is for two types of technology, the other's for one type of technology. There's a whole bunch of commercial commissions, some of which I'm not prepared to reveal because they're commercial deals with two external companies. But I can assure the committee that the company took a great deal of time and care in making sure that we protected taxpayers' funds in these deals.
And that assurance would carry a great deal more weight if you would give us the specific figures and the rationale for any difference in the figures.
Well, I can't give you specific figures because they're confidential, but what I can also assure you is there's been independent views, as you I think probably know, by the government, independent reviews of the deals.
Will they remain confidential?
In that case, I think, yes, some specific figures will probably remain confidential.
Mm.
It was argued by Kevin Morgan in a piece on Monday, I think, that the price per customer being paid under the Optus deal is substantially higher than the price per customer being paid under the Telstra deal.
And how would Mr Morgan know?
My question to you is that right or not?
And as I've said, I can't answer that question in those terms because the two deals are different.
So we might need to move on. I think you've got the answer, as best an answer you're going to get tonight. Have you got more questions?
I do have more questions. I don't think I've got a very satisfactory answer at all, in fact, but I'll move on.
Okay. And be conscious, I think there's about 4 other members who are wanting to ask questions, so if you make it a couple more.
You mentioned in your opening statement that there are, I think, 14,256 homes now passed.
That's correct.
How many services in operation are there right now?
I'd have to take that one on notice because that includes the services that are in the 3 sites we have in Tasmania, together with the services are just beginning on the first 5 release sites. It, of course, changes day by day, but we can give you a number probably for tomorrow.
If you could take that on notice, that I would appreciate that. And could you decompose that number by speed bracket? In other words, those who are taking a 100 megabit per second service, if any, those who are taking a 20 megabit per second service, those who are taking a 12 megabit per second service, or whatever the brackets are that the retailers are offering.
I think we could probably do that, yes.
Thank you. What's the status of the special access undertaking that, as I understand it, the company is required to lodge with the ACCC?
Well, we will, part of this, the associated document with the special access undertaking is our wholesale broadband agreement, which I believe we have scheduled for the 19th and 20th of July to have the 3rd public consultation and review of that WBA. In parallel, we have been holding discussions, as you would expect, with the ACCC on the special access undertaking. That is progressing. We will probably take inputs from the 3rd public consultation on the WBA, incorporate that and submit it to the ACCC in due course.
Do you have a target date for the lodgement of the SAU, the special access undertaking?
No, I don't have a target date. That will probably be done in consultation with the ACCC. The
HFC networks of Optus and Telstra, which are to be effectively withdrawn from service in the provision of consumer and small business broadband.
And there it is. There you go.
We've got to go.
We've got a division on the fibre deployment bill, so if you want us to go...
I wouldn't want to hold that up, no?
Hopefully we'll have the chance to continue.
Yeah.
I thought you guys are... Didn't the bells go for you guys? You finished?
We have a bet informally whether you... No.
Is there a quorum we've done with NBN?
I think there's 2 of them. You do have quorum.
So this will be the acting chair then?
I'm comfortable if you carry on. You guys want to sort it out through Stephanie?
You can be chair, Nick.
It's up to you guys.
So we just we don't.
I'm happy.
We just yeah.
You'd be good as chair, acting chair.
Well, I nominate Ursula as chair.
It's a public hearing, so we should really have everybody here.
Yeah, fair enough.
Last time I had Doug as chair, we ended up with almost 50 days.
That's a good reason.
That's a good reason I shouldn't chair it.
Well, I agree with that. I agree you shouldn't chair it.
get straight back into it. With some questions from Mr. Ludlam. Senator Ludlam, sorry.
My room, but apologies if I cover ground that you've already addressed, and just let me know if you have. I'm interested in your statement of expectations. You were requested or required, if you will, by the government to engage a panel of providers for greenfields estates. And I understand that that's been your intention from the beginning. Can you just tell us what the status of that panel is?
I have to check, Senator. I'm not sure if the and perhaps Darryl could help me out here. The statement of expectation required us to have a panel of providers, or suggested we could have a panel of providers if we found that was the optimum way to approach it.
All right.
I think that's right.
There was a suggestion?
Proposition which was to be tested in the field, and it was.
Okay, you've tested it. What was the outcome?
The outcome was, our judgment was we were better served in meeting the objectives by having one partner with considerable experience and enough resources and skills who could assist with the greenfields job that we had to do using our architecture and the one design. We looked at the possibility of using a number of possible suppliers of fibre to the prem in greenfields, and the complexity of dealing with numerous technologies, numerous systems, and then trying to integrate all of that was simply would have been quite a difficult job. Not absolutely impossible, but quite difficult. When you couple that with the fact that there were a number of quite small players who you'd have to say, did they really have the capability to do this? And we had some tenderers who looked at only specific locations. They didn't want to work on a national basis. They wanted to only work in specific locations. This would have been a very complex issue to manage. We were also under a very, very tight timescale, so we took the option which we thought was going to give us the best in terms of reliability, in terms of ongoing maintenance of the network, and the lowest cost that was achievable, and will allow us to actually do the job, and that's where we ended up.
Tell us how the tight timescale came about. The Parliament had an earlier version of the Greenfields Bill probably more than a year ago, so this stuff's been in play, and you've known that there was going to be a requirement to bring other parties on board. So how did it come to end up being a tight timeline when things have actually slipped quite substantially since you got started?
Because it's quite difficult to provide, as I mentioned in the opening statement, we've now got some 1,800 applications from developers. They're scattered across several hundred sites around Australia, some of them being in quite remote places. To try and put provide a fibre to the prem service to those in the timeframes that developers want is quite difficult to do when you don't have a network. So when I say there's a very tight timeframe, and we had no choice, this isn't like brownfields where service can continue. These new developments, there is no service there, so if we don't provide it, they don't have a service. So we had to meet those timeframes, and it was a very tough job to do.
It has led and it will lead to accusations that this is just another example of competition being collateral damage on the path to a national broadband network, in the sense that I think it was the government's intention that you at least evaluate the idea of taking on multiple parties to do the greenfields work.
And we did evaluate that.
Okay, what can you provide the committee with by way of documentation of the process that you went through?
I shall have to have a look at what I could provide. A lot of the information that was sent to us is obviously a response to a tender, and I'd need to check what we can and can't provide.
No, I've been pursuing this kind of stuff for the original RFT for a couple of years now, so I understand that you're not going to be able to provide me with the bids. I'm more interested in the thought processes that led you to deviate from the path that I think there was some expectation that the government had set you on that there would be more than one provider. Any evidence as to your thinking, as to NBN Co's thinking, as to why one provider was the best?
Mm-hmm. Okay. We can certainly lay those out. We can provide you a document that says this is why we took the approach we did.
Yeah. All right. That's great. I appreciate that.
Mm-hmm.
Is that it?
Yeah, I'll leave it there, Chair.
Okay.
Thanks very much.
Now, Paul, can we make it possibly one, even two final questions?
Thank you. Two final questions. So,
the question I was asking you before, Mr Quigley, that I was coming to, what would be the cost comparison between the approach that you have taken in the existing HFC footprints and an alternative scenario in which you did not build out your own new network but used the HFC network to deliver services? Could you take that on notice for us and let us know what...
Well, I can give you a preliminary answer to that. Please. I know, Mr Fletcher, of no HFC network that provides a wholesale-only open broadband access platform anywhere in the world.
Thank you for that. The question I'm putting is, if you were to take an alternative strategy of using the HFC network to deliver services, what would be the CapEx savings involved?
But do you mean, as per the objectives the government set for us, for an open access, wholesale-only network? Does it have to be open access and wholesale?
Yes, yes, and
Okay,
the HFC networks are subject to the open access requirements of the Old Trade Practices Act, now the the Corporation and Consumer Act, Competition and Consumer Act, already.
I am not aware of either Telstra or Optus providing wholesale services on their HFC network.
They're subject to the access regime.
But they have never done it, as far as I'm aware.
It's, as a matter of law, they're subject to the access regime. In any event...
HFC?
Yes.
Okay. Well, certainly in terms of technology, is that capable of satisfying the requirements that we had? I'll certainly have a look at that.
Thank you. The other question, last question I want to ask.
Thanks, Paul.
Thank you, Mr Chairman. In the procurement process to appoint the party which is to build NBN Co's wireless network, which I understand is Ericsson.
Yes.
Can you inform the committee whether all major international wireless network vendors were given the opportunity to participate in that tender process?
We, after a preliminary evaluation, went to, I believe, a tender process with what we regard as the two major vendors of wireless networks that had the capability in Australia to build this type of network.
Which two were they?
I'm not sure whether this is confidential or not, who the other one was, so let me take that one on notice if I can.
Thank you.
Okay. Ed. Thanks, Paul.
I understand, Chair, you want to keep this moving. And
I'm just conscious of time and there...
I understand the number of people. I have, if I can just flag a range of questions I want to ask in relation to workforce issues. I used to have some great conversations with one of your managers, Kevin Brown, about workforce planning by NBN, and I look forward to having likewise with yourself, Mr Quigley.
Look forward to it.
Especially with a project as big as this, but there are two particular...
we're on time.
I know that, but I've also got an interest in the workforce issues in relation to the project. The questions I wanted to ask, first questions were in relation to the $100 million that has been set aside for training with Telstra. The question I've got in relation to that is if you can explain your understandings of how that $100 million are to be used and what are the sort of performance indicators, if you will, about where you feel that Telstra has satisfied its end of the bargain, so to speak, in relation to training people up to work on work with fibre as opposed to copper.
Okay, well, I believe that that question is probably best addressed by Mr Quinlivan, since the $100 million is actually paid by the Commonwealth, not by NBN Co.
Yeah, so there's a part of the agreement with Telstra. It includes a component for retraining Telstra staff, and this was agreed in the June 2010 announcement, and the detailed arrangements have been developed, and Telstra have various milestones that they're required to meet in return for the payments, and the intention is that they'll retrain their staff for to work in a new fibre world, and the avoided redundancies create significant value for Telstra.
And what are the milestones that you referred to in your response?
Well, I don't have the document here. I know there's some quite detailed material. Can I take that on notice and provide you what I can?
Sure. I guess the second question then is I'm interested in NBN's model in terms of workforce and why it sees that the entire project can be done by contract staff and that there'd be very little room for NBN hiring its own workforce to help in the network planning, or very little workforce to be engaged in network planning and also the actual physical rollout of the network.
Well, we don't anticipate it all being done by contracting staff. We in fact are roughly 800 people or so now, employees of the company. Quite a number of those are engineering staff engaged in architecture work and planning work. We've got a growing planning team. When it comes to, as I described before, the physical, detailed planning that's on a site-by-site basis, our view is that's best done by the construction company under our supervision of overall architecture, because they will be doing the physical layout and then they do the construction. If you separate those two, you end up with probably not as tight an interface as you would like. So it makes good sense for the constructor to do what we call the detailed design on an FSAM by FSAM basis under our, first of all, architectural rules, and then under our top-level design. So we are doing a substantial amount of design work ourselves. It's in terms of construction, there is a very capable industry in Australia for construction, and it seemed to us, unless it turned out to be otherwise, we should try and leverage that capability in Australia. Because that is their business, and that's their ongoing business, long term.
Yep. Do you want to, just to consummate this issue of workforce, through the Secretariat, do you want to put in some questions on notice? And because I know it's been chasing this for some time, and it's of interest to the whole committee, whether a list of questions can be put in, and if you can provide us with some feedback. Is that the best way?
Yeah, sure. And just for the record, I just can't fathom how the department wouldn't have the details about, in terms of the training arrangements.
Well, we do have them. I just don't have them present with me here at the moment. But we'd be happy to give you a description of what's in the agreement with Telstra, and as much material as we can. Be happy to provide that.
Sure.
Malcolm.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Quigley. Can I remind you of the Commonwealth Government's procurement guidelines? Are you familiar with them?
In general terms, yes.
Well, they were published by the then Finance Minister Lindsay Tanner in 2008, setting out a number of principles on which government contracts should be negotiated. Principle 4.2 stated, and I'll quote that to you, value for money is enhanced in government procurement by A, encouraging competition by ensuring non-discrimination in procurement and using competitive procurement processes, B, promoting the use of resources in an efficient, effective and ethical manner, and C, making decisions in an accountable and transparent manner. And my question is, how can the NBN Co say that it entered into the Silcar contract consistent with this principle of non-discrimination if, as you've conceded, you negotiated intensively with only one company?
Mm-hmm. Well, first of all, if I could clarify the premise of your question, Mr Turnbull. As a government business enterprise, we're not subject to those Commonwealth procurement requirements. That doesn't mean that we don't voluntarily use them as guidelines, and wherever possible we do use them. our overriding interest and our overriding objective is to get value for money for the Australian government and hence the Australian taxpayer. It is not uncommon for large telcos to enter into such negotiations as we did. I've been, as a previous life as a vendor, entered into such negotiations with companies such as AT&T, for one, who may decide under certain circumstances for even large, very large bids that this is the right way to approach the problem. We did go out, as I'd said before, to a broad-ranging open tender process, but it was clear after some months of effort that that wasn't going to get us where we needed to be in terms of the best value for this project. So we changed approach.
Right. Okay. No, thank you for that. Now, your own company's procurement strategy was approved by your board in December 2009. Is that right?
I'd have to check on that, but yes, certainly it was approved by the board.
Okay. That strategy has not been published, has it?
That I don't know. We have quite a number of policies on our external website. I'm not sure whether that is one of them. I'd have to check.
Okay. Well, my information is that it has not been published on your website. And on that basis, would you agree that the failure to publish that procurement strategy runs counter to the principle of transparency that the Finance Department's outlined, which I just read back to you?
No, I wouldn't necessarily agree with that. I'll have to go and have a look. First of all, I've got to check the basis on which we made decisions about what we put on our website and what we don't.
Well, how can you be transparent about procurement if nobody knows what your strategy is?
Well, our strategy will vary depending on what it is we're trying to procure.
Well, doesn't transparency mean that you've got to be open about the way you do business, and if you have a procurement strategy, you publish
I thought if you're talking about the construction contract, we were quite open. We went through an open tender process and then we publicly said this process was going to be suspended and we're going into a different process, and we made that absolutely public. Okay,
now, can I just refer you now to your own corporate report, your latest corporate report? You stated in it that your procurement strategy, and I'm quoting to you from your own company's document, should, quote, demonstrate alignment to the essential probity, transparency and value requirements articulated by the Department of Finance and the Australian National Audit Office. That's the end of the quote from your document. And I put to you that on that basis you have breached your own procurement strategy with this contract, because you've said in your own corporate report that your procurement strategy is aligned to the values articulated by the Department of Finance, and yet you said a moment ago that you don't believe that you are bound by those principles articulated by the Department of Finance, and you have not complied with them.
No, what I've said was that as a GB, I was just making sure that everybody understood, as a GBE, GBEs, if I'm correct, are not bound by those Commonwealth procurement guidelines. That's correct. That's a statement of fact. What I said is the company used wherever it could and where it thought it was in the best interests of getting the job done at the maximum value and protecting the taxpayers' interests, we would obviously follow those guidelines wherever possible. If we thought that we could get better value and do a better job by perhaps using a slightly different process, then that's the process we'd follow. But once again, we were perfectly transparent about it. We made it public what we were doing and why we were doing it.
Okay, thank you. Has the contract been finalised now?
Which contract?
The Silcar contract.
It has.
It was been finalised, has it? That happened on the 17th of June?
I can't tell you the exact date, but I can tell you it's been finalised.
Okay. All right, it has been finalised. Okay. You stated in your press statement about the Silcar contract, and I'm quoting to you from your own press statement, that the NBN Co would assume the risk of other infrastructure providers and Silcar would assume the risk of construction. Can you, unless you've done this earlier, and I apologise, I was detained in the House on the 5 Deployment Bill, can you explain to us what that means and describe what specific areas of risk the NBN Co will be responsible for?
We did cover it.
You have covered that?
And we've got some information coming back to us on notice on exactly that.
Okay.
on how they calculated risk and how they manage risk.
All right, okay. Well, if I could just then ask you a couple more questions following on some questions that Senator Cameron asked you. He referred to competition from HFC and so forth. I just put to you, in your corporate plan, page 105, you've forecast some retail prices. Do you recall those estimates there?
Mm-hmm.
And the estimate for the basic 12 megabits per second service is $53 to $58 a month. Is that right?
And as we made very clear, these are prices that are purview of the retail service provider.
Yeah, no, but
we're a wholesale company.
This is your best guess.
It's just, yes,
okay.
our best estimate.
And you'd agree with me, wouldn't you, that that is substantially more than, for example, the prices charged for broadband services of similar and indeed higher speeds in other broadband-enabled markets, including South Korea?
As we discussed a little earlier, it really doesn't make a lot of sense to compare, as the OECD has said, different markets for prices.
Well, can you just answer?
No, I wouldn't agree with you.
You'd agree with me?
No, I wouldn't agree with you.
Okay, well, is 30,000 won more or less than $53 to $58 a month?
I don't know today's exchange rate.
Don't you? It's about 1,100 won to the Australian dollar.
How much is that?
Yeah, how much is that? So,
Oh, so you can't divide 30,000. It's about $30. Let's say $30, 30 Australian dollars a month.
Sure, that's a bit disingenuous. Give us a break.
No, Mr. Quigley,
put the question.
Mr. Quigley, do you agree with me that the retail prices you're forecasting on page 105 are substantially higher than the retail prices for broadband in South Korea and indeed in many other OECD markets, including the United States?
oh, I know some broadband prices in the US. I lived there for some time, and no, I wouldn't necessarily agree with you that on a like-for-like basis and for what is trying to be achieved in this country, if you took some spot areas, remember there's a lot of range of prices for different types of services in Australia, so it's not so simple to do a one-off spot comparison. So I wouldn't be prepared to agree with you on that basis.
Okay, well, I'll ask you another question about price. Accepting that prices for broadband in Korea are significantly lower than as forecast on page 105 of your corporate plan, do you believe the fact that there is extensive competition, facilities-based competition in Korea, contributes to those lower prices, or do you think that competition is irrelevant to those prices?
I would say I would have to look very carefully at the Korean market. One thing I've learnt over the years about telco prices is they're very complex. One needs to look in detail at what's being offered, what the duration of the contracts are, whether the modems are thrown in, whether they're not, what's the guarantees on download capacities, what are the speed, are you doing MDUs, are you doing SDUs, how much government subsidies in there? It's a complex question.
And I might, I'm conscious there's two more questions.
Okay, all right.
So
well,
if
just,
we could wrap it up, and then there's opportunities for questions on notice.
Okay, all right. Well, just perhaps if I could just ask one question to Mr. Quinlivan then, from DBCDE. Mr. Quinlivan, can I just, because I think this is in your area, the universal service payment, right, that Telstra is receiving. That's been the subject of a lot of criticism by other telcos who have contended that it is about twice the level of the existing payments and represents an extraordinarily generous payment to Telstra, particularly given it is paying Telstra to maintain a copper network which it is your plan to overbuild and render obsolete and of course to be decommissioned. Can you tell us whether you agree that this payment is in fact twice or substantially more than the existing payment, and whether you regard it, what your view of this industry criticism is, because it has been very trenchant criticism and the suggestion is that this is a sweetheart payment as part of a package of payments given to Telstra in order to get them to vacate the field and not compete with the NBN with their HFC network and other fixed lines.
Well, I'm not sure the criticism has been trenchant, as you say. Certainly we haven't been on the receiving end of that criticism. This might be slightly apocryphal, but my understanding of the origins of the current number is that there was some rigorous analytical work done in the late 90s, which generated a cost for the then universal service obligation of somewhere in the order of 550 to 600 million. And the then minister thought that was too high, which is perhaps not a surprise, and decided the cost of the USO would be 250 million. And the current number, which I think has been stable for several years, has been derived from that number with adjusted for market trends over time. So the current number bears no relation to the cost of providing that universal service obligation. It's based on an arbitrary number developed quite some time ago, which has just been adjusted over time, sometimes for probably quite defensible reasons, others for pragmatic reasons. So the number that has been agreed with Telstra has been based on a serious analysis of the costs. There was a...
Sorry, it has been based on...
It has been.
Okay.
There was in the suite of documents that were released last week a document by a financial consultant who was engaged by McKinsey's, which estimated the cost of the various categories of universal service obligation, payphones, the standard telephone system and so on. And in that document there is an estimated range of costs of providing those services, and the numbers that have been struck with Telstra by the government fall squarely in the range of values identified in that study.
That study has been published?
That study was published on our website with all of the documents on the day the Telstra deal was announced, so it's freely available. Okay. And I think perhaps the reason we haven't been on the receiving end of the criticism that you referred to is that the industry people that we deal with, perhaps they're the same ones who've been talking to you, are aware of that and have dealt with it and understand the origins of it. And accept that it's a rigorous piece of work.
There was quite a big story in The Australian quoting a whole series of people from the industry making criticism.
I'm well aware of that, but we've also spoken to all those people who seemed quite relieved the number was as small as it was. So I think there's a variety of ways of looking at it, and it depends a bit on the audience.
Senator Fisher.
Oh, thanks. Gentlemen, the existing Optus cable, which passes about 1.4 million homes in Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne, will NBN Co, and I understand it's capable, it could be upgraded to top speeds of 240 megahertz a second. Will NBN Co decommission that and start again, or will you upgrade and utilise?
It's not up to us about whether we decommission. It's Optus who'll make that decision on their HFC plant. And as I said a little earlier, some of that HFC facilities will be used to continue to supply base stations, mobile base stations, and perhaps business customers. So I can't tell you which parts will be decommissioned and which won't. In terms of speeds available on HFC, I haven't done an analysis of what is practically available, never mind the headline speeds of what people talk about is possible. As I said before, using LTE, the latest LTE technology, we are providing a 12 megabit per second service on cell sites using LTE. You will hear top speeds talked about of 100 meg and more.
Okay.
So
all right,
we have to be very careful about what is really possible, but the other point that I'd make again is HFC is not so easy to provide a wholesale open access solution
Thank you.
on.
Thank you. Given that that decision is Optus's, so whether it's decommissioned or upgraded is the cost of whichever therefore embedded in the Optus deal.
No, Optus made, they did their own calculations on options that are available to them and decided they wanted to do a deal with us at a value that was accretive for us.
Is there any separate transaction or agreement between NBN Co and Optus, or the government and Optus, in respect of that existing cable and what happens to it?
Well, I can't speak for the government in terms of NBN Co. No, there's no other deal other than the one we have announced.
Okay, all right, thank you. Townsville. Now, Townsville was to be the first mainland rollout site, wasn't it?
As I might have said before, there were different times at which different
Townsville was
sites
to be before Armidale, wasn't it?
It'd be good if the witness was allowed.
There's about 8 minutes left, Senator Cameron, and Mr Oakeshott is chair. Mr Quigley, Townsville was to be before Armidale, wasn't it?
At one stage,
yes,
in the rollout,
yes,
it looked like Townsville was going to be completed before Armidale.
And why wasn't Townsville completed?
Well, there was a cyclone there.
Yes, thank you. So, what damage did the cyclone do to the infrastructure that was rolled out at that time?
It brought down a number of pieces of fibre infrastructure that we had already put in place, but even more importantly, access was quite difficult for quite some time.
Yes.
There were, which we found quite understandable, there were other priorities for contractors doing civil works in Townsville.
I'm not asking about that. I'm asking about the damage that was done to the infrastructure, the NBN infrastructure already laid at the time Cyclone Yasi hit.
Okay, I can send you some photographs if you'd like, Senator.
How much infrastructure was laid? To what extent was it damaged? And maybe it was totally wiped out. I'm asking, to what extent was it damaged?
No, it certainly wasn't totally wiped out. There was damage done to a number of fibre sections, and as I said, I can send you the pictures if you'd like to see.
Can you please quantify the extent of the damage and the extent of...
I can tell you how many segments were damaged, yes.
You can now?
No, I can go look it up.
So it's on notice.
Okay. Can you... In quantifying that, can you give us a sense of proportion if you're going to talk segments, for example? Was it 3 segments out of 10? Was it 10 segments out of 10 that were damaged?
Well, it wasn't 10 out of 10, otherwise it would be all of it. So yeah. I will certainly try and provide that information.
And
I think NBN's agreed to, and the CEO's agreed to take that on notice, Senator Fisher.
Thank you. And can you quantify the infrastructure which survived Cyclone Yasi in Townsville?
I think NBN and the CEO have agreed to take that on notice.
I hope so. I'm just making sure, Chair.
If I quantify how much was damaged, surely that quantified how much wasn't.
I'd hope so. So thank you.
Yes.
Okay.
Are you familiar with Mr Quigley?
Yes. Quite familiar.
Take a look in the mirror.
With head agreements reportedly reached with the ETU and or the CEPU and companies to employ workers to roll out the NBN?
No, I have to take that one on notice. If you have a specific question, I can try and answer it.
Were you consulted by anybody in the process of the drawing up of those agreements?
I've obviously had discussions with Mr Brown, who is our head of HR and Corporate Services, who had the prime responsibility for the EBAs that we have entered into.
Are you talking about EBAs for NBN Co's workers?
Yes, I'm talking about EBAs for NBN Co.
Okay. I am asking about agreements between the various unions and companies external to the NBN to engage workers to build the NBN. And I'm asking you whether you are familiar with or were consulted at any stage in the preparation of those.
That's a matter for the companies and the unions. It's not a matter for me.
Okay, so you haven't been involved?
No, I haven't been involved in
Has
negotiating.
Mr Brown been involved?
Not that I'm aware. I mean, that's an issue for the company and the unions.
Fine, that's why I'm asking.
Yes.
Thank you.
Certainly. Now, if we believe that some relationship is going to have an impact on us, then of course we'll inquire about that, and Mr Brown may have had discussions, but unless that's the case, I wouldn't imagine he would.
Can you bring Mr Brown with you next time you appear before this committee so that he can help us with the sorts of questions that I have, and indeed the sorts of questions that Mr Husick might have,
well,
given your references to his
be
knowledge?
Many questions.
Asked Stacks more questions than I have on this issue, and I defer to the chair's wish that we limit the questions.
Yeah, true. And so...
Thank you for my entire 4 and a bit minutes of questioning tonight, Chair. Thank you.
No, but have you got more?
Oh, no.
Okay. Senator McDonald.
Thank you. Just very quickly, 2 of your senior executives resigned recently. What were their names? Flanagan was one. Soterio. Did they actually...
Mr Soterio, I think, worked for Mr Flanagan.
Not for NBN?
Yes, but you're saying 2 of mine. So
well, 2 of NBN's senior executives.
I'd call senior executives people who are in the senior management team.
Did these people resign? Were they on a contract?
On a contract, I'd have to check on that.
Okay,
Senator.
if you could do that, I'll notice. I'm interested in what their contract said about if they resigned before their contract is expired, what, if any, payments they were given when they left, or what penalties they paid for leaving early. Could you get me all that information on notice?
Provided I'll check with our HR people to make sure that's proper to do so, but yes, I will try and do so.
Well, I mean, it is proper to do so, whether you mention figures, but what their contract said.
Well, I have to check, Senator, but I understand when it comes to employment contracts between NBN Co and its employees, some of that information is confidential. Even the terms of the contract are confidential.
Well, did they get paid a lump sum at the time of their termination?
We have various arrangements on different contracts. Depends on the circumstances under which a person leaves or which they're terminated.
Well, can I just refer you, by way of Senate experience, when David Hill left the ABC and resigned well in front of his time, he was paid a lot of money.
He was the CEO, was he?
Yeah, well, he was the head man of the ABC.
Okay, well, you're talking about somebody who's 3 levels down in the organisation.
I'm just giving you the example that the Senate usually requires answers to those things, and did in Mr Hill's case, and we do, I would imagine this committee would in this case. Just want to know what they were paid for leaving early, if they were paid anything. So if you could take
I'll take that on notice, yeah.
You said before documents were taken commercial in... I'm afraid I've got 2 minutes, Doug, and you've had a lot more time.
2 minutes. I would like you, Chair, to consider whether that does fit within the terms of reference. Individual employees' rates of pay and individual employees' termination payments. I'd like you to have a look at that.
Well, I'd also be interested in whether there was any confidentiality imposed on them when they left.
And just in response to that, so we're clear, this is an issue that the committee does want to look at in regards to the 2 individuals involved, and therefore I think it's a fair question, and it has been taken on notice. And you know, I'm sure Mr Quigley will provide as much information as commercial and confidence arrangements allow.
Very quickly, your arrangement with Telstra and Optus that we've been talking about, did they anticipate that a certain number of customers would be transferred?
The NP, for example, with Optus, the 800 million NPV number is based on an assumption of how many customers would come across onto the NBN. That estimate was made by Optus, how many customers they have.
Can you just give us, in both cases, the number of customers you anticipated coming across?
Certainly the numbers of customers has an influence on how much both companies are paid.
Well, you must have had an expectation of a certain number of customers coming across. I want to know either how many did come across, if that's the end of it, or if it's still happening, as I'm sure it is.
Hasn't started yet, Senator.
What you anticipate, what your forward planning was done on the basis that X number would come across. So I'm wanting to know what your X number is, both in the case of Telstra and Optus.
Well, I think that kind of calculation is the one I referred to earlier, which we will now, having completed the Telstra deal, the Optus deal, the Silco deal, done a number of other things, we will look at again in our overall corporate plan, which we will reissue in due course.
But in doing the deal with Telstra, you must have had an anticipation that X would come over. And I'm wanting to know what your anticipated gain was from whatever you paid them. Okay?
Understand. We may or may not be able to provide that information depending on what can be calculated from it. We're in a process where I have to be extremely sensitive. Telstra is going through a shareholder vote. It's a public company. I just have to be careful with that.
Well, Mr. Quigley, just finally, in answer to Mr. Fletcher, you indicate you couldn't answer because of commercial in confidence. I think there's a ruling from the Senate, and Senator Cameron will no doubt correct me if I'm wrong, that it's not sufficient for witnesses just to claim commercial in confidence, or perhaps this is freedom of information I'm talking about. You actually have to establish why it is commercial in confidence, bearing in mind that this is taxpayers' money and a hell of a lot of it. Could you, perhaps because we haven't got time now, could you sort of on notice establish for me why those deals, having completed the deals, having paid the money, what is now commercial?
We haven't paid the money.
When do you pay the money?
As progressively as we use the infrastructure and as the copper network, HFC network is decommissioned.
But the calculations for payment of the money is completed, the tenders have completed, or the buying arrangement. So, I'd like to know now why you're claiming that is commercial in confidence. And as I say, the Senate just doesn't accept you blandly saying it's commercial in confidence. It may well be commercial in confidence, but I'd like you to establish, perhaps on notice, if you can't do it in 20 seconds now, on why you're claiming that those contracts, having been completed, are commercial in confidence.
Happy to do so on notice.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. And there's one final question that we have missed, just that we did want to get on the record as far as option B, if the Telstra shareholders for some reason reject agreements reached, what is, is there an option B in place? And in as short a time as possible, if so, what is it?
Okay, well, there's clearly, in order to value the deal with Telstra, we had to have a business case without the deal, which we've calculated to calculate the net benefit to us, but it's not a plan we're actively working on. We're assuming the deal will be consummated. As I said, that has to have ACCC approval and it has to have shareholder approval. A number of other CPs to be met, but we are working actively on that. So we don't have, if you like, an up-to-date alternate plan, and I think it would be kind of remiss of us to do so at this point in time. If we were to hit that eventuality, we'd obviously do some work on it.
Okay. Look, thank you for attending to assist the committee and for running over time this evening. It is appreciated. You have been asked to provide a range of additional information. So, as much as possible, if you could forward it to the Secretariat no later than Friday, the 22nd of July, where possible. And certainly, I know there's many members of the committee who may have further questions, and they will be sent in through the Secretariat, and where possible, if you could respond to those in good faith as well. So thank you very much for your attendance this evening, to both of you.
Pleasure.
In regards to, so that's the conclusion. In regards to just authorisation, is it the wish of the committee to authorise for publication, including publication on the parliamentary database, the proof of the transcript of evidence given before it at the public hearing today? There being no objection, it is so resolved. Again, thank you everyone, colleagues and witnesses for the time today, and declare the public hearing closed. We have had